everybody. For those of you guys that are joining us from China, a good evening to you, and good morning if you're joining us from the US, and good day for everybody in Europe as well. My name is Devin Lau, and I'm the Assistant Director of Yale Center Beijing, and I'm very happy today to host yet another one of our talks with the Yale University Press on some interesting books that they have coming out, including today's book, which we'll discuss in a bit. Just as a quick note, because we have a good moderate sized crowd here, if you're willing to turn on your webcams, that's very nice to be able to talk to some faces instead of just a black screen with names. And so for those of you guys that are willing and able to, it would be really appreciated if you could turn on your webcams. That's always nice. Because some of you guys may be new here, I'll do a quick introduction to Yale Center Beijing. Yale Center Beijing is Yale University's only university-wide center outside of New Haven, where we host all sorts of programs across the university, covering all sorts of topics, from economics to politics to biology and art history and music, drama, everything. And we like to showcase some of the most exciting things that are coming out of Yale University, of course, but also just entering into a global dialogue with thought leaders from around the world. And so that's what we're doing today. Today, we're very lucky to have Professor Chris Armstrong join us. He is Professor of Political Theory at the University of Southampton. He studied politics at the Universities of Durham and Bristol, as well as at the London School of Economics. And he's also been a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford's Center for the Study of Social Justice, as well as at Australian National University School of Philosophy. He's published over 40 academic articles and is the author of Global Distributive Justice, Justice and Natural Resources, and Egalitarian Theory, and Why Global Justice Matters, Moral Progress in a Divided World. And so, as you can see from his previous publications, he's very much interested in global justice and has turned his attention to a more specific field within that for his latest book, which is on oceans. And so we'll be discussing his newest book, which is published by Yale University Press, called A Blue New Deal: Why We Need a New Politics for the Ocean. And so he'll give a quick talk, and then we'll be opening up time for Q&A from the audience. And so we'll have further instructions when we get there. But without further ado, Professor Chris Armstrong.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So it's wonderful to be here to talk to you. I just leant over to grab the book because now it actually exists. I'm really happy to be able to show it to people. So before I start, my understanding is that we have people in the audience from all kinds of different backgrounds who studied all kinds of different disciplines. So I'm going to try and, although I do talk about some philosophical ideas and also some scientific understanding of the ocean will come through as well, I want to make this accessible to everybody. So I'm not going to be assuming lots of special knowledge, which is kind of appropriate because, as Devin says, I'm a political theorist or philosopher. I'm not an ocean biologist or anything along those lines. So writing this book has been a kind of voyage of discovery for me too. So, and communicating to a wide audience is part of what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I call the book A Blue New Deal: Why We Need a New Politics for the Ocean. I just saw a question pop up. Yes, it is available on Amazon. And the puzzle I start with is that the ocean, of course, as we all know, covers most of our planet, roughly 70% of the surface of the Earth. But in political life, it's often out of sight and out of mind. So very few governments have ministries for the ocean. It doesn't really appear in public consciousness with any great regularity unless something exceptional happens, like a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal or something along those lines, and we suddenly start thinking about the ocean. But the ocean really matters. So we depend on the ocean for our survival. So as a school child in England, I was told that the rainforests were the lungs of the earth, that they absorb carbon dioxide, use the carbon, and emit oxygen that we breathe. And that is true. And therefore, the rainforests are hugely important. But we now know that it's really the ocean which is playing the role of the lungs of the world. It's absorbed the great majority of the carbon that we've emitted, and it also produces most of the oxygen that we breathe. And that's mainly because of tiny organisms that live in the ocean called phytoplankton, plant plankton. It's also the case that the ocean regulates temperatures and drives weather patterns. So our planet really wouldn't be habitable if it didn't have this ocean smoothing out variations in temperature. Many people depend in agriculture on monsoons, which originate out at sea. Clearly, hundreds of millions of people are nutritionally dependent on fish too. So there's a huge dependence on the ocean. And if anything, that dependence is growing. So social scientists and economists often talk about what they call a blue acceleration, which is an oceanward shift in the center of gravity in our economies. Ocean industries are growing faster than the economy as a whole. We see ever greater effort and money and resources thrown into industrial fishing, but especially into fish farming. We see oil and gas drilling in this century overwhelmingly taking place offshore. We may soon see mining of the deep seabed, because scattered across the deep seabed are potentially hugely valuable minerals, including lots of minerals that are key to high-tech industries and the industries of the future. So our economies are relying more and more on the ocean. At the same time, however, we are increasingly appreciating that we are undermining the environmental foundations of the ocean as an ecosystem. Obviously, the big story here is climate change. So climate change is creating two massive challenges at sea. One effect that climate change has is that it causes the ocean to warm. And when the ocean warms, it expands. So the expansion of the ocean drives sea level rise, and something like 170 million people worldwide live no more than 1 meter above sea level. But it looks as though those people are going to be extremely vulnerable to climate change driven sea level rise. Even if we take really serious efforts to mitigate climate change in the coming decade or so, a degree of sea level rise is already locked in and is going to create major problems. So some entire countries could disappear, particularly in the case of small island states. But even people in large countries that are not going to disappear may well lose lots of agricultural space to sea level rise. Many cities, especially in Asia, are located close to the coast. The warming of the ocean also creates another effect, which is because many fish are quite sensitive to temperature differences, they will often move in response to warming. And so in general, fish are moving away from the equator and towards the poles, which for people who live in, high northern and southern latitudes might be a good thing, at least for a while. But for people who live around the equator is not a great thing, because it means that there is a great nutritional challenge there. The other big change that climate change is bringing about is the acidification of the ocean. So if there are any scientists among you, you probably know much more about this than I do, but as the ocean absorbs more and more carbon, it in effect forms carbonic acid. Its acidity increases slightly. And this is a major problem because many of the organisms that are at the base of the marine food web have calciferous shells. They have shells that are made up of calcium, which will be partly dissolved or completely dissolved in an acidifying ocean. So these creatures will not be able to repair their bodies or even grow at all, perhaps if acidification continues. And this, we don't really know what the consequences for the marine food web could be, but they could be really serious. Now, we know there are other environmental challenges out there in the ocean as well. There is great public awareness these days of plastic pollution. Some people are aware of harmful fishing practices, so overfishing in general, but also practices like bottom trawling that destroy vulnerable habitats on the sea floor. And we recently learned, there was a study from the US that told us horrifyingly that bottom trawling appears to be responsible for more emissions of carbon than the whole global aviation industry, because it stirs up carbon which is locked away currently on the seabed. Agriculture often pours lots of nitrogen into rivers, inadvertently. That spurs the growth of algae that then dies off and sucks the oxygen out of the water, and we get these dead zones where the fish die, and people dependent on fish have a serious problem. So that's the first major problem, and maybe the biggest problem we face in the ocean, the challenge of environmental destruction. But there's also what I call in the book a second oceanic crisis at play, which is a crisis of inequality. So clearly, if you look at a map of the world, you can see that some countries lack access to the sea. There are landlocked countries. And economists tell us if you are a landlocked country, although there are success stories like Switzerland, most landlocked countries are very poor. This is a disadvantage. There are also countries which have a very modest coastline compared to the size of their population, and other countries which have very large coastlines. In many cases, countries like France and the United Kingdom, which have huge marine territorial entitlements, have those entitlements in part because they picked up possessions, as they call them, during the colonial period. So small islands out there in the Pacific or the Atlantic, where almost nobody lives, now grant those post-imperial countries large, what get called exclusive economic zones in the ocean, which I'll talk about shortly. A country like China has a huge population, but for its size, a relatively modest exclusive economic zone. A country like Chile, for example, has a much smaller population, but as you know, it runs all the way down one coast of South America and has a huge exclusive economic zone. So this is one source of disparity or inequality in the ocean economy. Another final source of inequality in the ocean economy is going to be capacity, state capacity and economic capacity. So some of the marine industries that I've mentioned, seabed mining, offshore fossil fuel extraction, are extremely technologically challenging and therefore expensive. And many countries just don't have the resources to engage in those industries. So what they end up doing is selling access to corporations based elsewhere who reap most of the dividends. And some countries simply lack enforcement capacity. So off the coast of West Africa, there are some of the poorest countries in the world, but there are some very rich fisheries. It's a very fertile marine ecosystem, but there are really pervasive problems with illegal fishing that local states just don't really have the resources to effectively tackle. So we have these big problems, a kind of multifaceted environmental crisis, and growing inequality in the ocean economy. So what I really want to do in the book is to ask two main questions. How did we end up here? How did we end up with these crises? And how can we do better? So let's talk first about how we got here. So I don't know how much people in the audience know about the law and politics of the ocean, but the governance of the ocean is really a patchwork. We have different kinds of zones in the ocean which are governed in different ways. And that patchwork arises because we've thought about ocean politics in two starkly different ways. And each of those ways of thinking about the ocean has left a legacy. So the first great approach to governing the ocean is the idea of freedom of the sea. And freedom of the sea essentially says you can go wherever you want to, and you can extract whichever resources you might come across. And that's historically hugely influential in ocean law and politics. It often gets associated with a 17th century Dutch scholar called Hugo Grotius, or Hugo de Groot, who gets involved in this debate between what is now called Holland and Portugal out there in what they call the East Indies about who is entitled to sail where. But what's important is that Grotius gives us this picture of the ocean, which suggests that it's simply inexhaustible in its size and in its resources. In Grotius's mind, nothing that I do in the ocean is really going to affect what you do on the ocean. If I start to scoop up fish or pearls or anything else I might want to harvest, this doesn't have any impact on anyone else because the resources of the ocean are basically unlimited as far as we can tell. Now, of course, we now know that that's not true. In fact, arguably, even in Grotius's time, it should have been obvious that that was not true. In the European experience, for example, we saw overfishing of herring and collapses in fish stocks. We know that whalers in Europe were having to go further and further at sea, all the way down towards Antarctica, to find whales to catch because of limits on resources in Grotius's language. But still, in contemporary ocean governance in 2022, 70% of the ocean, what gets called the high seas, is essentially governed under the principle of the freedom of the sea. There are modest limits on what states can do out there on the high seas in terms of extracting resources. The other great approach to ocean governance is what we can call enclosure, which carves out part of the ocean and turns them into the territory of individual states. And in particular, the big change here happens in 1982 when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is signed. It eventually comes into force in 1994. And what it does is it says that each coastal state is entitled to an exclusive economic zone. And that zone can reach out for up to 200 nautical miles from each country's shore. And within that exclusive economic zone, it is the local coastal state which gets to decide what happens to resources. So if it wants to fish, it can. If it wants to extract fossil fuels, it can. It doesn't need to share. It doesn't need to offer access to anyone else. In a sense, it has resource sovereignty within those zones. It also has rights over the seabed. There's a parallel regime in international law called the continental shelf regime. Now, there is an argument for enclosure, and the argument says something like, you know, if we don't have enclosure, we will end up with a tragedy of the commons. People will do what they like. We ought to have stewards of the ocean, and individual states, if they have their own marine territories, will act as stewards, and we'll see more rational use and conservation of marine ecosystems. But the practice of exclusive economic zones is much more tragic. So the overexploitation of fish and the collapse of fish stocks accelerates after 1982 rather than being eradicated. There are some countries, Norway, for example, which has managed local fish stocks well, but there are many more examples where catch levels have become completely unsustainable. On the high seas, which is still governed under the principle of freedom of the sea, we have very weak institutions. So we do have institutions that govern fishing on the high seas. They're called regional fisheries management organizations, but they are clubs. And if a given country doesn't want to join that club, it's not going to be bound by any rules it negotiates on the fishing of particular stocks. We also have a situation whereby fishing companies can, as Law of the Sea scholars put it, they can flag out. In other words, they can transfer their vessel so that it sails under the flag of another country which simply doesn't belong to the relevant regional fisheries management organization. So if they want to catch as much tuna as they can, there aren't really any legal impediments. So I think this picture explains why ocean politics is failing. If the ocean is a single interconnected whole, if its ecosystems are interdependent, then we need to, I think, to think about ocean politics in new and more progressive ways. So fortunately, the world's leaders are not completely ignorant of the challenges that we face in the sea. Within the United Nations framework, negotiations are ongoing for a new legal instrument which would govern what gets called biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So the marine genetic resources out there in the high seas, for example, that treaty is in the making. And the draft, anyone can read the draft, it's on the internet. It contains some positive language. It says that we need to take an integrated approach to ocean governance. We need to be proactive. We need to embody a precautionary approach, control activities that could damage marine ecosystems. Unfortunately, the draft treaty as it stands today looks like it is likely to be insufficient in light of the scale of the challenges that we face. So one incredible fact about the draft treaty is it won't regulate fishing at all. Right? Fish are just not discussed in the draft treaty, with the implication that fishing activities can go on as they currently operate. The draft treaty is really clear to say that it's not going to undermine states' existing freedoms guaranteed under the freedom of the sea. But it may be that we have to qualify some of the states' existing freedoms if we want to tackle the environmental problems that we face. If marine genetic resources are employed, the draft treaty tells us that there ought to be some kind of benefit sharing mechanism. But the language it uses to discuss benefit sharing mechanisms are extremely vague. It looks as though benefit sharing mechanisms might be entirely voluntary. So it's also not clear how the draft treaty will turn around inequalities in the contemporary ocean economy. So to me, it looks like a missed opportunity. So just to finish, I'm aware of the clock. I think we need to do better in ocean politics, and I think we can do better. If we're going to better produce the ocean, protect the ocean ecosystem and achieve a fairer ocean economy, I think we need to set our sights higher. If we look at places like Antarctica, where we have a powerful, long-standing Antarctic Treaty, which was signed in 1959 and is still in place, what the Antarctic Treaty system does is to say effectively that the whole of Antarctica is a place beyond sovereignty, where states agree to cooperate to preserve Antarctica as a place of peace and of science. Extractive activities in Antarctica are completely outlawed. Right? States can't go to Antarctica and hoover up resources. So I think one question I would like to leave people with is why we couldn't do something similar on the high seas. At present, what we have in the high seas are marine protected areas that cover some portions of the high seas. But as I say, they are optional. If your state hasn't signed up to that marine protected area, there will be no limits on your activities. And even if your state has signed up to that marine protected area, you can switch flag and avoid being bound by those rules. So it looks as though on the high seas, constraints on economic activities are basically optional. And some of you may know that the mining of the deep seabed, meanwhile, is moving closer and closer. There are organisms on the sea floor which are incredibly slow growing, which are unlikely to be able to survive the impact of mining activities. But the legal framework to protect those organisms hasn't really kept pace with the technological developments that may make mining possible really soon. So towards the end of the book, just to finish, what I do in the final chapter is to engage in some really kind of radical blue skies thinking. I'm not claiming this is likely to happen anytime soon, But if we take the kind of Antarctic model, or if we take the model of, let's say, a national park, or maybe better, an international park, and apply it to the high seas, I think we can see an alternative future. So I paint a picture of what I call a World Ocean Authority that essentially acts in a kind of stewardship role over the high seas, will only allow extractive activities if it can be reasonably confident that they won't be destructive. And I think in practice, what that's likely to mean is that we turn the high seas into a place which is essentially a free-for-all, into a place where we don't allow many extractive activities at all. We don't really need to exploit the high seas. People are nutritionally dependent on fishing, but people who are nutritionally dependent on fishing are generally fishing quite close to their coast. They're not fishing several hundred miles out to sea where it's very expensive to travel because of fuel costs. So I think we have an opportunity to think differently about the governance of the high seas in a way that could allow the ocean's ecosystems to recover surprisingly quickly, maybe even within a single human generation. Okay, so that's what I had to say, and I look forward to any comments that people might have.
Great, thank you so much. I think there's a lot of room for questions and discussion and maybe even speculation. So what we'll do now is we'll turn it over to you guys in the audience for some Q&A. You have two options. You can either type out your question in the chat box on the bottom of your screen on your Zoom, and we'll be happy to go through those questions. Alternative, you can also raise your hand using the raise hand function, also on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'd be happy to call on people to interact directly with Professor Armstrong here. And again, especially if you're going to ask a question, it would be great if you could turn your video camera on just so that we can talk in person. And this is obviously a wonderful opportunity to be able to interact directly. So yeah, so feel free to ask questions either through the chat box or with your raise hand function, and I can unmute people who have questions. And it does usually take people a while to warm up, I know. So I'll ask the first question, which is if we were to just sort of go on what you were saying at the end there, what hopes are there of sort of being able to enforce whatever agreement or treaty we have in place? I mean, obviously, this is a question that's not just pertinent to the ocean, but there are lots of issues that have similar questions. But sort of, since you are a political philosopher, what are sort of the ways that we would enforce any agreement that we do come to?
Okay, great. So I would see the kind of World Ocean Authorities having a kind of binding authority over extractive activities in the high seas, as opposed to the situation now where constraints are kind of optional. Companies can opt in or out by switching flag and avoid regulations that they don't like. How might that come about? I mean, I'm very upfront in the book that this is a very ambitious option and looks politically unlikely in some ways. You might even say infeasible. My response to that, I guess, that worry would be twofold. One would be, one thing that's really clearly unfeasible and unrealistic is the thought that we can just continue as we are on the ocean with the blue acceleration and hope that everything will be okay. Because it looks as though we're really pulling the rug under some of the ecological underpinnings of life on Earth in our engagement with the ocean. So something has to change. So I suppose, as with issues like climate change, we're just waiting for it to be made clear enough to powerful actors that something has to change, and maybe there are even opportunities for powerful actors to transition towards a more sustainable model. So that's one thing I would say. Another thing I would say is that sometimes things happen in politics that surprise us. So the idea that an entire continent, Antarctica, seventh continent, would be governed in the way that it now is, probably would have been called fantasy, in the decades leading up to the Antarctic Treaty. political observers probably would have said, well, of course, powerful states will try to turn Antarctica into their own territory. Of course, they'll try to exploit its resources. But we have this incredible truce called in 1959 that still holds, which I guess has to give us some optimism that we have this, we're not entirely, as political scientists call it, path dependent. We're not always entirely locked into given ways of doing things, but we can sometimes arrive at critical junctures where options open up that were maybe not predicted by anyone.
Looks like we do have a question in the chat. How do you define ocean justice? How many dimensions will you consider when you are considering ocean justice? Dimensions including distribution, participation, recognition, etc. And could you also illustrate a little bit about what's the differences between ocean inequality and ocean justice? Oh, inequity and ocean justice.
Yeah.
So
So
inequity, inequality, justice, and yeah.
So that's a great question. I don't really use the language in the book of distribution, participation, recognition. That's partly because I try not to introduce too much philosophical jargon if I can avoid it, because I'm appealing to a wider readership. And it's partly because I'm not entirely convinced about the utility of that kind of threefold distinction, or at least sometimes I think thinking about issues in terms of distribution, recognition, participation can lead us to think that we have these three separate tasks that we have to tick off and that they are relatively independent of each other. Whereas, of course, many concrete struggles look to be partly about what we might call distribution, partly about recognition, and so on. So what I do in the book is, I think one of the central chapters lists what I call 7 principles of ocean justice. So luckily I have the book here and I can kind of flick through it and remind me of what they are, right? So the first one is obvious, and it just says we all have a stake in the ocean, right? So that doesn't necessarily say that we all own the ocean. I don't adopt the language of common ownership, but we all have a stake in what happens to the ocean because it's going to have such a big impact either way on our fate, right? So that leads to a second principle, which is a principle of democratic inclusion, which looks, I guess, like a principle of participation on the language of the question. So I think it's really striking how little we are ordinarily involved in ocean governance. By and large, we've left it to international lawyers. We don't have a vibrant democratic politics of the ocean, but I think we could do with one. The third principle says that the ocean is a space of rights. And it sounds like a strange thing to say, but if we have, for example, human rights, they don't disappear when we go out onto the ocean. But actually, in practice, many of the very worst practices in a contemporary global economy happen out at sea, where people are far away from the protection of their fellow nationals, unions, or lawyers. So in the global fishing industry, there are some really kind of horrendous abuses. The fourth principle is sustainability and the precautionary principle, that essentially says that we shouldn't be engaging in forms of exploitation on the ocean that we have reasons to believe may be harmful. And then the final 3 principles are fair benefit sharing. So the spoils of the ocean, insofar as it can be exploited, ought to be fairly shared. Fair burden sharing. So if we need to tackle environmental problems out there at sea, they also need to be fairly shared. And finally, fair transitions. So for example, if we set up a marine protected area, and this means that people can no longer engage in fishing there, we can't just leave them to their fate, right? Some very poor people are engaged in fishing. And so we need to ease that transition for them. So the question about inequity, inequality, injustice, finally, I think I would say that the account, I describe it as an account of justice, but it's clearly an egalitarian account, in that the value of equality comes through strongly in many of those different dimensions that I talked about. It looks as though the ocean is becoming more and more of a space of inequality because of things like geographical differences, but also access to capital. And I really believe that we ought to be trying to turn things around so that the ocean genuinely serves everybody. Okay, that was a really long answer, but hopefully it answered your question.
Well, it was a long question, so seems fair to me. All right, we've got a question from Lewis.
Hi, Professor. Am I audible?
Yes, great.
Okay. So first, I would like to thank you for a wonderful sharing, and it's pretty informative. So my question is, since you have mentioned about the geographical difference and those inequality that might be difficult for us to, sort of construct a ocean of political system or like a legal system to monitor a tragedy of common. So I mean, one of the point that I want to brought up is that since water or ocean is flowing, that the resources are not constantly staying at one sort of location. So if the fishes are immigrating, so how should we allocate the resources, or how should the supranational organizations monitor those flowing resources, and if there's an over exploitation or a pollution from one specific state, how should we judge the impact or the actual damage from them, and how should we punish them? So due to the complexity of the ocean flowing, how I mean, my question is which sort of political system can actually effectively sort of address this problem?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. So one of the issues with a world where something like 40% of the ocean falls into states' exclusive economic zones is that, well, we might think that system would work very well for resources that stay where they are, right? So, fossil fuels on the seabed, fine, this system might work. They're not moving across borders. But things like fish, as you say, of course, do move across borders. So even within the current framework of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, we do see the later addition of a framework that's meant to govern what get called kind of straddling stocks. So fish that move from one state's exclusive economic zone to another state's. But it's not entirely satisfactory. It hasn't, I think, entirely tackled the problem where you have a kind of, well, maybe this is too strong, but you seem to have something like a kind of prisoner's dilemma where, one state knows that if it doesn't exploit fish that move between the boundaries of state, then the other state will. So how would my proposals deal with this? So I don't think I have a total solution because some of these questions are very practical questions, and I'm thinking at a level of kind of broad design principles. I think if we had a world ocean authority on the whole of the high seas, this would be an advance on the high seas at least, because what we currently have is this patchwork of these regional fisheries management organizations, and they are peculiar organizations because some of them govern fish in particular areas, and some of them govern particular kinds of fish, and some of them overlap, and it's a strange patchwork with gaps. I think that system is clearly not working, and we could see some really kind of tragic outcomes where individual states veto what could be really useful conservation measures on the high seas. So for example, I talked about Antarctica. So the continent of Antarctica is governed by the Antarctic Treaty system, but the waters around Antarctica have been the site for some measures, some attempts to create what could be the world's biggest marine protected areas. And I think one of those efforts succeeded, but was much smaller than originally intended. And another effort to create what would have been the world's biggest marine protected area was just vetoed, right, by one party. It was Russia, as it happens. So we have a framework where states just seem to have excessive power to call the shots about what's going to take place. Asking states to give up that power is clearly difficult, right? We know this. This is a reason why in climate governance, we have, a Paris framework that sets targets, but doesn't really have enforcement. I'm not foolish enough to imagine that states will just happily sign up to enforcement mechanisms out of the goodness of their hearts. It may well be that we have to see more and more environmental crises, growing evidence that existing ocean politics institutions are not working before we see the kind of critical mass necessary for states to agree to bind themselves in this way. So in short, I don't really have the answer to that big political worry. I think it may well be the case that we fail, right? But I think sometimes all that the philosopher can do is at least to describe what a better solution would look like, and to try to do the hard work of persuading ordinary citizens that this is important and that they should lobby their politicians. I wish I had a magic wand that would convince everyone that this is going to happen politically, but I'm an optimist to a degree, but not to a foolish degree, I don't think.
Great, thank you. If anybody has any more questions, please feel free to keep them coming. I guess one of the big questions is sort of who are the kind of key stakeholders at play here who have the power to influence, right? So there are certain nation states, obviously, that have the economic and political power, but are there other entities that can play a role or should play a role? And I guess even like just to kind of clarify, like who exactly are the like powerful nation states that we really need to sort of make sure we're influencing?
Sure. So, I mean, we could think about that in different ways. We could think about the countries that just have very large exclusive economic zones. So there we're talking about Russia because it's just huge, but also countries like France, the UK, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And those mainly have huge exclusive economic zones because they still own these islands, dotted throughout the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In terms of the countries which are really kind of powerfully invested in the ocean economy and industries like fishing, then we would also talk about countries like the UK, the US, France, but also China, South Korea, Japan. We might also think about corporations. So there are some scholars in Sweden led by Henrik Osterblom, I think, who've published some really interesting work on what they call Keystone Corporations within the ocean economy. So if we take the different ocean industries, if you like, things like fish farming, fishing, fossil fuels, and so on, in all of these cases, there are roughly 10 corporations that have about a 50% market share or approaching 50% market share. They're slightly different corporations in each case, of course, but there's a kind of a strong pattern of power that these organizations have in many industries. Now, we might think that means it's going to be hard to achieve change because those corporations are going to be powerful, they're going to exert political influence. But it can also mean that if we can lean on them in the right way, we can really make a difference. So for example, if you take an issue like, the exploitation and abuse that fishermen can suffer out there on the high seas, there may well be considerable potential for consumer campaigns to target those 10 Keystone corporations, which have an amazing kind of resource and information base. If they really wanted to ensure that their supply chains were slavery free, for example, they probably could. And so I think there is an opportunity there for concerned consumers to say, what are you doing? What are you doing to make sure, can you guarantee to me that no one has been abused in the supply chain in putting this fish on my plate? So sometimes I think the economic concentrations within some of these industries makes it easier to make a difference, because these corporations, they don't want a bad reputation. So I think that can produce some openings.
Yeah, that's great. I guess the follow up to that then is, I think obviously the ocean is a very big place, and we're mostly on land, so we have no idea what's going out there. So can you sort of raise the red flag on some of the more maybe obscure issues that maybe we aren't aware of that we should be aware of? I think we're all somewhat aware of overfishing and deep ocean kind of trawling and things like that. But are there other kind of key things that we're not thinking about or that just don't get the typical media attention that should be?
Sure. So maybe I'll give a negative and a positive story. So in terms of the negative story, one of the big eye openers for me in researching and writing the book was the situation that fishers can face out there on the high seas. And even within the exclusive economic zones of some relatively wealthy countries. So there are some horrifying stories that I relate in the book of modern slavery and workers being beaten and even killed, bodies thrown overboard. According to many empirical scholars, the kind of epicenter of exploitation and abuse within the ocean economy is around the Gulf of Thailand, where there are these vessels that stay out to sea for long periods of time, scooping up fish to be fed to fish farms that produce prawns or shrimp, depending on where you're from. But also in the coasts off countries like New Zealand and Scotland, there have been companies found to be engaged in modern slavery, which is quite striking, right? Because I think most of the citizens of those countries would be kind of horrified to hear that. There have been some success stories there too. So, for example, one thing that New Zealand did, which was really interesting, is, of course, if you have an exclusive economic zone, you get to decide who fishes in your exclusive economic zone. And this does give you the power to insist that fishing outfits uphold reasonable labor standards. And the way that New Zealand did this was simply to say that no one can fish in New Zealand waters unless their vessels are flagged with New Zealand. And we can therefore inspect them and ensure that labor standards are applied. That isn't necessarily the only way to get at that problem, but it does show that where there's a kind of political will, we can make a difference to some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And maybe I'll tell a positive story. So one thing I learned in the book is that there are some, amazing creatures that live out there on the ocean. And in some sense, the ocean is really home to them rather than to us. People don't really live at sea, but many, many animals do. And we're learning more and more about the incredible roles that some of those organisms play. So I think everyone on the planet owes a great debt of gratitude to plankton that we don't really talk about very much. But if it wasn't for the phytoplankton, the plant plankton, we wouldn't be breathing. Our atmosphere would just be, full of carbon. The zooplankton or animal plankton is the bottom of the whole marine food web. But also creatures like whales, right? So whales, we now know, are what marine biologists call ecosystem engineers. They have a huge impact on the ecosystem. So to put it somewhat crudely, so the ocean is an interesting ecosystem because it has lots of organic matter, but most of the organic matter over time falls down to the sea floor, where it can't sustain life at higher levels where there is light. But whales have this incredible kind of churning effect, because whales spend some time at the surface because they breathe like we do, but they also go down to the deeps and churn up nutrients. So one thing they do is they eat enormous quantities of things like plankton or krill, and they poop, right, which spurs the growth of huge amounts of phytoplankton. And so it looks as though if we wanted to tackle climate change, lots of scientists have suggested that maybe we need to engage in some kind of high-tech system of geoengineering at the ocean, sprinkling iron filings in the ocean so that it can absorb more carbon or whatever. But actually simply ending whaling could have a tremendously positive effect in terms of locking up carbon, because whales, they spur the growth of phytoplankton, but they also lock away literally tons of carbon in their own bodies. And when they die, they fall to the deep seabed, where that carbon stays safely for years or even centuries. So that's a positive story, I think, of something I learned in the book, that go whales. Whales are wonderful.
I don't know. That's very interesting. We've got some more questions here. Hong?
Okay, so thank you for Professor Chris. So my question is about your book, more about the conception about environmental justice or ecological justice. Sometimes I found people just use this kind of two conceptions together. So I want to, if you can help us to distinguish those two kinds of conceptions. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So I think people use those terms in different ways, but as far as I understand it, the general distinction says that ecological justice tells us how, in a sense, the world ought to be, what we might owe to, how we might have to behave in relation to ecosystems. We may have duties to animals, maybe even to plants, right? So these are questions of ecological justice. But then environmental justice points us to questions about how we share the benefits and burdens of that between human beings, right? So at least if you look at the work of people like David Schlossberg, I think that's the way that he's using the term. So environmental justice is, in a sense, the social justice questions that flow from our need to protect the environment. Which human beings need to change their behavior in which ways, who ought to bear the costs. And ecological justice is about the big questions of, what our kind of wider stewardship obligations might be towards the natural world. I don't know if that rings true to the way that you've seen the terms used. So I think in the book, I am raising both kinds of question, because, for example, I have a chapter which is about the rights of marine animals, where I talk about whales and dolphins, but really I'm just talking about whales and dolphins as an example of the way in which we might think about the rights possessed by the creatures that live in the sea. So I try and make a case that I hope is relatively uncontroversial, that just in the way that we have human rights, because we have various interests, then whales and dolphins also ought to have a key set of rights, such as the right not to be imprisoned or tortured or needlessly killed. So those are going to be questions of ecological justice, if I understand right. Okay, and then those are going to throw up challenges of environmental justice when we come to allocate the costs of protecting the environment. So, you know, if we think that an indigenous whaling community in Canada should not be engaged in whaling, we have really pressing questions of environmental justice. How do we help them to preserve their lifestyles in a way which doesn't do damage to these really important cogs in the broader ocean ecosystem? So I do talk about both. I think they are really important. I suppose the way I think about the relationship between them is that we probably need an account of ecological justice first, that then throws up questions of environmental justice that we have to deal with later.
Great. Thank you, for asking that question. And that's, I think, a very good clarification. Lewis, do you have another question?
Yeah, I got a follow up for the professor. So, if we're establishing a ocean political system, should we consider those landlocked countries to contribute to the ocean protections or like get involved in this system, since they're not that I mean they're not contributing to the pollution of the ocean. So, should we consider them into like the legal system as well?
Yeah, okay, that's a really interesting question. So, I mean, ever since the Convention on the Law of the Sea came into force in 1994, we've had this question about what the role of landlocked countries is in ocean governance. There are some kind of gestures in the convention that say things like, if some states have spare capacity within their exclusive economic zones, maybe they should offer that capacity to geographically disadvantaged countries, which is kind of the language that's used for landlocked countries. But that's not really a binding obligation, and nothing really happens, right? So when countries that can't fully exploit their exclusive economic zones, in a sense, hire out that capacity to other countries, it's not to landlocked countries, it's to generally to, you know, wealthy fishing states. So they've never really had a real role in ocean governance, but I do think that they ought to. So, you know, if we think that the ocean is key to life on Earth, and if it plays this foundational role in supporting all kinds of ecosystem functions that we depend on, then people in landlocked countries have a stake, just as anyone else does. So I think one question that your question was pointing out was whether we really ought to see them having a duty to pitch in and help meet the costs of protecting the ocean. And I think, generally speaking, my approach to this kind of question is that two kinds of moral principles seem to be relevant there. So what tends to get called the contribution principle and the capacity principle. So the contribution principle says, you know, are you causing the environmental problems that we have to deal with at sea? If you are, then other things being equal, you probably have a duty to help solve those problems. And it is possible that a landlocked country, I mean, if you think about a country like Switzerland, it's probably got pretty high emissions per capita in terms of carbon emissions. And so it probably is having an impact on the ocean environment. So on that kind of model, it would stand, we might well plausibly think that it has a duty to help meet the cost of ocean protection. And of course, in terms of capacity as well, it's a very wealthy country. So I really don't think we should rule out that landlocked countries can have duties to pick up the tab for some of these environmental problems, if they contribute to those problems and if they have the ability to help us deal with those problems. But also, if there are benefits that could be taken from the ocean legitimately, then I think they ought to be much more integrated. It's a really interesting question exactly how that could happen. So, landlocked countries in Latin America, like I think Bolivia, has been having this ongoing discussion with Chile about whether it could have a kind of land bridge to the sea that would allow it to access the sea. That hasn't really got anywhere, but it's a really interesting political question. Okay, so I hope some of that is relevant to your question.
Great. Well, I think we are just about at time. Maybe if you have any sort of last kind of key ideas that you want to make sure we take away from our time together. Of course, to read the book, but
yeah, read the book, of course. But I think what I really want to do with the book is to convince people that we ought to have an ocean politics, right? Because sometimes what we have is ocean law and ocean governance, but people see the ocean as not being particularly important on a day-to-day basis. They have other concerns, understandably. But I think I want to bring home to people that how the ocean is governed is going to be really consequential for lots of people. So we ought to be invested in it. And I think we have a right to be involved in ocean governance.
All right, well, thank you. Absolutely. I think you made that point very clear today. And so thank you for that. Thank you all for attending. As per tradition with the Yale Center Beijing, we ask that everybody turn on their cameras because we like to take a group picture at the very end, as if we were all attending together. And I will also unmute everybody so that everybody can thank Professor Armstrong.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.